very good afternoon and welcome to the second of the Isle of Man Government Media Q&A briefings that have been held, where you, members of the public, get the chance to ask questions directly to the decision makers of the day. Now, since our first briefing about just under a fortnight ago now, we've been inundated with requests either on email, Facebook, live video, Zoom, people who want to comment or ask us to put a question on your behalf to the health ministers, all the ministers and the health officials as well. And we're hoping to get through quite a flavour of those today as well. I'm delighted to say we are joined by the Education Minister, Dr. Alex Allinson. Thank you for your time. We did actually approach Dominic Cummings and his team, but Dominic said even by his standards, a road trip to the Isle of Man was just a little bit too far. So no Dominic today. However, I'm delighted to say we are joined by Maria, Eric, Connor and Stuart from Braddon, Ramsey and even further afield in the north of the island, and we'll be speaking to them shortly. Without further ado, let us push on, and just to set the ball rolling, I will put a question to the Minister, if I may, just to get us moving. No active cases we have heard today, which is great news. Is now the time really to be looking at, after half term, just over a week's time, to be allowing the schools to go back in full, and perhaps one or two of the education union reps to be perhaps a bit more flexible than it appears they have been thus far?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and something that I think a lot of parents and pupils want to know about. What we're doing at the moment is getting through a really difficult phase, and I think there is more confidence coming out now from the general public that we seem to have got this under control. The Department of Education, Sport and Culture has always been really quite clear that we want to do this in a gradual, planned way in terms of getting children back to their schools, getting some face-to-face teaching going on again. And I think we need to do that to get parents alongside with us, and also the pupils, to give them the confidence to go back into the school for the first time in what has been over 2 months. In terms of the unions, we've been working quite closely with them, not in terms of them dictating the agenda, but working with them, because one of the key factors about opening schools is that we need the staff to be able to do that, the teachers, but also the cleaners, the caretakers, to open up those schools, make sure they're clean and safe for those children. So I'm quite confident that on the 15th, when we open up all the schools, then start getting the children back in there on the 17th, if we are like we are at the moment in terms of a stable health situation, then we can look to accelerate that return of students into the schools. But we need to do it in a controlled way so that we can actually deliver what we've promised to those children, which is back to face-to-face teaching with their teachers. And
so without putting words in your mouth, do you believe there is a chance that certainly by the end of June we could be in full operation again at all island schools?
I think, again, there are lots of variables, and what we've seen is an acceleration of the changes on the Isle of Man as people get more confidence, as we've driven the numbers of coronavirus cases down to 1 at the moment. I think if we can maintain that, if we can maintain that confidence, then we can get all those children back into school before the end of the academic year. There are some logistical challenges with that, and there will always be those children and those parents who don't want to come back to school because they don't see it as being safe. I want to be able to reassure them it is, but also reassure them that if they want to keep their child at home and homeschool them, that's absolutely fine, and that we as a department and their teachers will support them in that through remote learning.
And as it stands, there are 0 active cases as of today. So are we now in a position where, as long as we keep our borders closed, we should be in a much healthier position?
I think you're absolutely right. The Minister for Health and Social Care has always been quite cautious, and he would be. And I think the clinicians at Nobles are always quite cautious in terms of giving long-term predictions of this virus, because there's still so much we don't know about it. However, we do know that by the actions of the Isle of Man people, we've managed to suppress the spread, we've managed to reduce the number of cases, we've managed to save the NHS from being overrun, and we're now in a far better place than we were even 2 weeks ago. So I think if we can actually maintain this, through the goodwill of the people of the Isle of Man, then we can look at relaxing a lot of the restrictions we've got. Again, in a controlled way. It won't be a free-for-all, but we can do it nicely and gradually accelerate that, but still have that I was going to say alertness, but I won't use the word alert. Still have that, I suppose, that awareness that if we were to get an outbreak of 1 or 2 cases, we could stop, we could get it under control again and then move forward. Because I think we need to start getting used to managing the risk of a virus that may be around for quite some time. I'm not quite sure whether we'll ever get to the point of New Zealand, which has declared themselves virus-free, because there will always be that potential for 1 or 2 outbreaks. But by having the right guidance there, if we do get another outbreak, if we do get 1 or 2 cases, various parts of the island, we now know how we can deal with it by testing, by quarantining, by controlling.
Presumably, if we're waiting to be 100% virus-free, we'll never open up.
Exactly, and it's living with that risk. It's living with that realization. We now know far more about this virus than we did right at the start. We know about the effect it's had on our community, particularly, unfortunately, in a nursing home. We're aware of the reality of it now, but we need to be able to live with that risk. And that risk, it will be whether you go to the shops, whether you send your child to school, whether you go for a walk in the park and bump into somebody, quite literally. There is that risk, but if we can live with that risk, manage it, actually mentally deal with that risk, then we can get back to a sense of normality. It won't be exactly the same as it was before all this started, but we can adjust to it. And the Isle of Man has always been incredibly good at adjusting to change.
Thank you, Minister. We will go to our first caller now. Connor from Braddon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure being able to speak to you this afternoon. My question is, how will border restrictions affect students travelling to and from university in September? For example, will the families of returning students or returning parents all have to self-isolate upon returning to the island?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Connor. There are lots of questions about what's going to happen in September in terms of universities. I know some have said that they're going to switch completely to online learning. And that puts university students, particularly those who are starting out their first year, in quite a difficult position. It's hard enough to decide which university you want to go to, but then you've also got to decide, do you want to go back in September? Would you rather wait until after Christmas, for instance? Would you like to carry on online learning? Would you like to take a year out and defer that? In terms of those people who want to go to university in September, the border restrictions don't stop you leaving the island, it's just the coming back. Had a final exam.
The ones.
Yep. I think in terms of the home tutoring, yes, that is allowed. We know that gatherings can take place. You can have up to 2 other people in your home from another household group. And as we go through this period, hopefully we can relax that further. So one-to-one tuition would be absolutely fine. In terms of social distancing, ideally it should be the 2 metres at the moment, but again, government are looking into that, looking into the science behind it, and should be able to relax that. In terms of musical instruments, there are some inherent risks with viral spread. through either singing or particularly wind brass band instruments, those sort of things. So you need to be a little bit careful there. You also need to be careful in terms of hygiene. But certainly those one-to-one lessons could restart, yes.
And Shelley also has submitted a question here. I'd like to ask the Minister whether the preschool credit that has been paid to the nurseries whilst they were closed will be recalculated to support the children that it's actually intended for, just further down the channel.
Yeah, what we've been doing throughout this very difficult period is to maintain a lot of the preschool facilities, even though the ones that weren't open, so that when we can restart them, and we'll be going to be doing that this month, they can reopen. So the preschool credits that were given have continued and will be available for all those parents who want to carry on using those from now on.
And just a question from Charlotte regarding the mental health of young people and children. Does the department need to actually look at adding lessons to the curriculum to help combat mental health issues, perhaps as soon as September, given this period is lengthening by the day? Absolutely.
We look at the educational needs of children, but schools are so much more than that. It's the social needs, but also the emotional needs of children. So what we've been doing in the department is working in almost a staged reintroduction of children back into their classes, but making teachers and other people who work in schools aware of some of the issues they may have when they come back, and certainly working with some of the educational psychologists so that we've got that support there. I think the other issue is that those children who were absolutely fine in February and March when they left school may be very different when they come back because of that isolation, because of those anxieties. And so we're going to have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis, be very, very aware of it, and try to help those children reintegrate so that when they get back to school for the next academic year in September, they're going from a running start rather than having to catch up.
Thank you. Let's just change tack slightly now. EasyJet, wanted to talk to you about EasyJet. It was announced yesterday the airline will not resume flights in mid-June as initially planned. Our borders are closed, obviously. But surely if no one flies due to the ongoing quarantine requirements, the airline effectively, if this goes on indefinitely, could pull out. I mean, does the government have a plan B?
The government have been working very closely with a number of airlines. Obviously, the situation in the entire industry is uncertain at the moment, and some of them are quite concerned about the UK government's quarantine ideas that apparently are going to come into play this month. What we've been doing is keeping those contacts going, explaining the situation, and been getting some very good feedback from all the airlines. They're aware of our situation. They still want to do business with the Isle of Man. They still want to preserve those links. But when we are ready to open up our borders, they will be ready to provide those flights. And whilst nobody can predict exactly which airlines are still in business by September, the alliances we've made as a government with those airlines I think are robust and will stay. And so when we are ready, we can start again re-establishing those important routes for us, both in terms of tourism but also in terms of business.
And there's been assurances from the airlines in question that they are interested and maintain a viable interest in the island routes.
Absolutely, and actually some of the airlines have been looking at other routes, for instance, whether it's to Ireland or to Birmingham, and want to expand the variety here because they see an opportunity with more landing slots being open at some of the regional airports now. They see an opportunity for developing the links between the Isle of Man and other jurisdictions.
Thank you. Let us go take our next question from the public now. I can see Maria waiting patiently up in Ramsey. Maria, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Dr. Allinson.
Good afternoon.
It's a question similar lines to what Connor asked, but more specifically, I'd like to find out, because our daughter is due to start university this September in Liverpool, we'd obviously like to drop her off, settle her off, and then return straight back to the island. Will we have to ask permission to return to the island? Will we have to self-isolate? Will we have to be tested? What are your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, again, that's a very, very good question because you're trying to plan ahead for your family. And again, I'm really not sure what the situation will be like in September. What we'd like to do as a government is gradually ease these restrictions as the health situation particularly in England and the rest of the United Kingdom stabilises. We know that other jurisdictions have adopted different methods to ours. We were really quite strict in terms of the border controls right from day one, but we've gradually loosened those restrictions to allow more repatriation of people coming back to the island, and also some of the key workers that are needed to come back to the island or perhaps go to the United Kingdom. I would like to think that by September, if the health situation stabilises in the United Kingdom and here, we can relax those further in terms of whether we have either a shorter period of quarantine or whether we use some of the facilities for enhanced testing that we have now. Also, we know that with the antibody testing coming online, that may give us some more data in terms of who is safe to go backwards and forwards. But again, we need the increased scientific data in terms of the immunity to coronavirus, how long it lasts for, and how effective that is. So in terms of your daughter going to university, I'd certainly plan to have those aspirations, to drop her off. As I said to Connor, it is very much a rites of passage. It's a really big day for a family to drop their child off at university. I'd like you to plan for that. And as we get close to the time in August and September, hopefully government can facilitate that and make it as normal as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and we will come back to you a little bit later on. We're getting a theme here of a return to normality, however you define normality. In terms of the economy and many people's lives, then, does the potential collateral damage stand to be much bigger than the virus itself locally if we're not careful?
That was certainly one of the concerns right at the start of this. So from a medical point of view, you can cure the disease but kill the patient. And when government started looking at the lockdown, closing down not only the economy but people's social lives, that was seen as a big worry, both in terms of the financial aspects of it but also the emotional and mental health aspects of that. So that's one of the reasons why we've been keen to have a phased return, to try to communicate that with people as much as possible so they could see a roadmap, they could see a way ahead, they can make the plans that the parents want for their children, they can see a future. Because certainly what I didn't want at any point was for people, for people's education, for their future aspirations, to be a victim of the virus.
Let us go back up north now. I can see Eric waiting in Ramsey. Eric.
Hi, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Can you tell me, my brother was told to isolate for 12 weeks because of an illness he's got, which is COPD. Now, he's going for a blood test on Monday, and am I correct in that it said in the paper yesterday he'll also get an antibody test when he has his blood test? And if so, how long does he wait for the result and how does he get the result? And the other thing about it is, in the UK, some of these people who were given letters saying they need to isolate for 12 weeks have now received another letter telling them to carry on in isolation. So which is correct? Is he safe to go out now?
I think that's a very good question, Eric. I know that the Department of Health and Social Care are writing to all those people who've been asked to shield. Obviously, the situation on the Isle of Man is different to the United Kingdom, and what we're trying to do is balance the risks of infection, which we know are very low on the island, with the positive mental benefits of going out. And so we're trying to encourage people to, again, accept the risk that we think is still there, but deal with it and live with it. In terms of the antibody testing, what the Department of Health and Social Care and Public Health are trying to do is to figure out how many people may have had the disease within our community but perhaps didn't know about it. And so what is the extent of the viral spread? So anyone going for a routine blood test will be asked for their consent to have that test done. I'm afraid I don't know exactly how long the results take to come back. I think it's just 1 or 2 days, and then those results will be communicated with the person when they get the results of the other blood tests that were being done for them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Eric. As it stands then, COVID-19 is everywhere, virtually, in our communities. And it's inevitable, I think it's accepted, that it will return to the Isle of Man in one form or another when the borders finally open, and will have to be managed year on, possibly year on, like the seasonal flu. So while we're in the position we are now, how do you think government, and there are other agencies as well, can perhaps better help people understand and accept this without going into panic and potentially another form of lockdown?
I think it comes down to, I suppose, the idea of living with risk. and risk calculation. And I think people in the medical profession, doctors and nurses, are quite good at that. They know when they see somebody with a cough that it's probably just something fairly straightforward, but it could be something worse. And we need to have that awareness within the community. And part of that comes down to confidence, that they have the confidence that if they do get sick or if they do see somebody, it can be tested and traced. And I think the Isle of Man's been unique in terms of the British Isles in terms of carrying on that testing right the way through, building up the contact tracing, so people have confidence that we are on top of this. The reality, as you say, is while we go through the next couple of months, it would be very unlikely that we wouldn't get 1 or 2 cases now and again. I hope we don't, but it would be very unlikely. And if we do, that's not the end of the world. That's not back to square one, because we're now in a much better position to deal with it. We can close down a particular area, we can look at a certain family, we can do the contact trace and see where they've been to, and get on top of the situation very, very quickly. And also we know we have the capacity healthcare-wise to deal with anyone who gets seriously unwell. Right at the start of this, there were worries after seeing what had happened in Italy that our ITU would be overrun, that our wards would be overrun. They weren't, because of the work of the Manx people. We now have that capacity and those resources to deal with almost any eventuality. So I think moving forward, people can be confident that the health service can deal with this, but also be confident in themselves that they now have the tools to deal with that risk. That if they feel unwell, they stay inside. That if they see somebody else unwell, they get them help.
I can see Stuart in the sunny north waiting patiently. Stuart, you have the Minister's full and undivided attention.
I wish I was up north, but I'm not. I'm down by the nunnery.
Well, that just shows you, doesn't it, with the information I've got. Carry on anyway.
Nice to see you again, Dr. Alex. And just before I start, I'd just like to say that on the whole, I think the government have done a pretty damn good job of the COVID-19 issue.
Thank you.
What I'd like to bring up is, at this moment in time, now we're starting to rebuild the economy. We've got the 3 top men in government, Mr. Quayle, Mr. Cannon and Mr. Skelly, telling or requesting that the public spend, use, utilise and use local. What I'm not hearing, Mr. Allinson, is the government issuing a directive to their own departments, post office and separate legal entities, i.e. commissioners and councils, to use local.
Okay. I'm sorry you haven't heard that. Certainly from a departmental point of view, we've been trying to keep money within the internal economy, trying to boost that. I think you're right that message has gone out to the public, but perhaps we need to emphasise it a little bit more in terms of the departments. And what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks is getting people back more into the office, trying to get the communications better within departments and within government to actually keep the money on the Isle of Man.
Okay, and the second part of my discussion is maybe you could even take this up, which I'd actually quite like, because I know it'd be done correctly, Dr. Allinson. I'd like an independent tender review committee setting up within the Isle of Man government. Last year, I was turned down on a tender when I agreed to everything in the tender, absolutely everything. And I was pushed around 6 government departments for 4.5 months, didn't get the help, didn't get the advice and didn't get the result. In the end, I had to go to my legal team, spend a fortune, right, on a tender that should have been awarded to me. When I spoke to Larry Hooper, Lawrence Skelly, other commissioners, they were shocked at the paperwork I had and why I... This is why I'm asking that we get a review committee put together where small businesses, medium or large, if they feel injusted by a tender, they can come to that committee and go, this is my case, here's my evidence. And then that tender review committee can have the power to question, query or overturn decisions.
Okay.
Cyberspace was dipping in and out a bit there. But you
got
got the gist, I think, yeah.
And I think as we get into this new normal, we need to look at the local economy. I think what we've seen throughout the last couple of months is the resilience of the Manx people, but also the resilience of Manx companies here. And we need to remember that and not take that for granted in ways that we may have done over the past few years. So I certainly agree with you that I think the way that government contracts are delivered, the way that money is spent on the island should be seen as a priority to keep the internal economy going. And I'm sorry about your experience in terms of tendering for government work. We will look at that again. We will look at how we keep our own economy going and also support those local businesses who have been supporting government over this very difficult period.
But will this include separate legal entities?
The Seagull, sorry, are you talking about the Post Office and Manx Utilities and the other statutory boards?
I'm talking separate legal entities, commissioners and councils.
Okay.
They have to come in under this, because from what I found out, commissioners can do what they want, when they want, with who they want, at whatever cost they want, and they are answerable to no one.
Well, the commissioners should be working alongside the right terms for tendering contracts, then awarding those contracts. So I'm sorry about the experience that you've had, and I'll certainly take that up with the DFE and see what lessons can be learnt, particularly in terms of local authorities, so that as we move forward, those local firms are looked after and treated in exactly the right way.
Well, I went through the DFE last year and I got nowhere.
Okay. Well, again, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about that.
Commissioners have to come under the DOI, and I can't even understand that myself.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the experiences you had as a business on the Isle of Man. What I will say is I'll take that up with the DFE, try to find out what went wrong, and we need to learn from that experience. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Learn from that experience to make things better for the future.
Thank you, Stuart. The Minister is obviously going to look into that for you. Thank you for your question. Just while we're talking about employment and furloughing, another question that's been submitted. During furlough, of course, we're encouraging people not to return to work. If people choose not to return, and there's no good reason why they shouldn't, should assistance cease?
Yes. I don't like the word furlough, but what the Isle of Man government have been trying to do is keep people's jobs open so that when they were physically able to go back, the job was still there for them. I think it's really important that we give people the confidence to go back to work. But if there are people who actually say, actually, no, I don't want to go back to work, then that government help will have to stop. We can't carry on paying this for forever. We rely upon the goodwill of people to actually, when they can, to go back to work and contribute to the system that's actually helped them get through this.
Let us take another question from Kirsty at this time. Any developments on family members being able to visit their families, their loved ones in residential homes, as long as they social distance? When will this be possible, do you think? And I'm sure this is a question we've heard people ask, but perhaps haven't had a definitive answer until now.
Yes, the people visiting elderly relatives in nursing homes and residential homes has obviously been a very difficult topic. And genuinely, I'm very, very sorry for those people who haven't been able to hold their hand of their parents as they passed away. And I've talked to people who were unable to do that in the last moments of their relatives' lives. The reason for it coming in was obviously quite clear, that we didn't want outbreaks of coronavirus in nursing homes. We've unfortunately seen the effect that that's had on our community at Abbotswood. What we are now working towards, and this is the Department of Health and Social Care, but with Comin support, is looking at the overall risk and looking at how we can allow people to go back into nursing homes, back into residential homes to see their relatives, but in a safe way for both of them. And certainly as we get through a little bit more of this month, again, if the health situation stays the same, if the perceived risk in the society remains the same, we can probably achieve that. It will be different. There'll be social distancing. There'll probably be masks. There'll be people washing their hands before, during and after. But we need to re-establish that human contact. Because I've had constituents tell me about, for instance, their husband who had dementia, and the wife was absolutely terrified that by the time she saw him after a couple of months, he may have forgotten who she was completely. We need to deal with this in a humane way as possible, but also in a safe way. So I'm hoping, again, if this current health situation remains the same, that we can move forward.
Thank you. Certainly without a vaccine, things there's no guarantee, but things couldn't be much better in the island, could they, at the moment, without being glib or relaxed or complacent about it? I mean, we peaked in April. We've no active cases now. So I appreciate you can't put a time scale on it, but going back to Kirsty's question, how optimistic are you that this will be sooner rather than later?
At the moment, I'm optimistic. Again, what we need to do is build in those contingency plans, that safety net, that if anything was to happen, if an outbreak was to occur, we could contain that, control that. And I think we now have the resources, the knowledge and the facilities to do that. So I think what most people will see over the next month is a gradual change towards a new normality. A lot of these restrictions will be peeling away, but at the same time, we need to do that in a very controlled way to give people confidence. At the moment, people won't go into nursing home because they would be terrified of spreading the virus. So we need to give people that confidence that they can go back and see their relatives, and that they can go back to school, and that they can go across to the United Kingdom to drop their children off at university.
Yeah, there are various phases, of course, but do you believe the current measures are partly contributing to an atmosphere of fear, which is holding back everyone for longer than need to be held back?
Yeah, in a way, yes, because when we started this journey, it was fear. It was fear of death, fear of overwhelming the NHS. And what we've seen, actually in the last week, I've had lots of emails by people talking about schools reopening, and half of them are saying you should have done it yesterday, and half of them are saying please don't do it until September. There is still a very much divided opinion. I think part of that is managing the risk. Part of that is people's own perception. If you've had a family member who died at Abbotswood, this is very real to you. If you haven't had anyone touched in your family and you haven't planned a holiday that's then been cancelled, it's all a bit surreal. And when we went into this, it was described as a bit of a phony war, because things were happening within nobles that nobody saw, but which were absolutely terrible at times. So I think once we get through that, yes, there is that necessity to learn from it. There is that necessity to manage the risk, but also that necessity to actually move forward together, not to leave people behind, but to take on board people's individual experiences and individual fear and deal with that in a rational way.
Thank you. Stuart may not have been in the sunny north, but Eric most definitely is. Eric, I believe you have a further question.
Yes, I have, yeah. A couple of weeks ago, the government were getting slated for not letting people come to the Isle of Man on compassionate grounds, or to leave the Isle of Man on compassionate grounds. Now, they did move, and they've allowed people to do it. But in the paper yesterday, there was a person now complaining that they have to isolate for 14 days and want that isolation taken away. Can you tell me you're not going to change that? Because I don't see why the Isle of Man should be at risk. All the people on the Isle of Man are a few people who want to not isolate. If they don't want to isolate, they shouldn't go.
Yeah, and again, Eric, what you're talking about is exactly is balancing that risk, balancing those very individual stories with the risks to the entire population. We now know we've got the facilities to deal with outbreaks of coronavirus. And so what we're trying to do is allow people to come to the Isle of Man on compassionate grounds, but within quite strict guidelines in terms of social isolation, in terms of quarantining, so that they are not at risk to the rest of the population. So whilst we will try and deal with it as humanely and compassionately as possible, we have the good of the entire island at the forefront of our mind, and the safety of the entire island. The Chief Minister has been quite clear that the border restrictions will be one of the last things to go completely, but as we get into June, July and August, we will be trying to make it easier for people to come to the island and leave the island as long as it is safe to do so, not only for them, but mainly for our island.
Yeah, that's good. That's the answer I was looking for.
Another satisfied constituent. Thank you very much, Eric. And we'll stay in Ramsey. Maria, I believe you have a further question as well.
Yes, thank you. Just in relation to possible contradiction in terms with regard to not being too close to someone in that you could touch them, yet you can travel in a vehicle with someone, which obviously means that you're sitting very close to someone.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount of research going on at the moment in terms of the ability to spread the virus. We know it's in droplet form, So if you're talking face to face with somebody, that is a risk. However, if you're sitting beside somebody looking forward, that risk is fairly small, particularly if you don't have any symptoms, particularly if you're not coughing. We also know that the infection rate in outdoor areas is far less than in indoor areas. So driving with the windows open, if we have good weather, actually reduces that risk significantly. We also know that actually masks seem to slightly reduce the risk of spread, which is why you'll often see that the police officers driving around, they will have masks on. Similarly, the ambulance drivers who are sitting relatively close together. So what we're trying to do is to trust people to take on board this advice, make the right decision for them to actually move forward, because certainly car sharing between members of a different family, although restricted to begin with, has been opened up, because we know that actually if we can have less cars on the roads, that reduces the risk of accidents as well. And it will be really interesting when we get through this period to look at some of the data in terms of road safety, in terms of accidents, both of car drivers, but also cyclists and pedestrians, and see the benefits of some of the measures we brought in.
Thank you, Maria.
So would you say if you have two people from different households travelling together in a vehicle, would you recommend that they both wear masks?
I certainly recommend that they look at the situation. One of them may want to sit in the back seat rather than right at the front if they can. They may want to sit behind the driver rather than directly across from the driver. But if those two people feel safer wearing masks, then I think I'd certainly support them doing that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. We've had a lot of questions from individuals and residents asking about their own health conditions. Now, I appreciate everybody's different, what they should do, but is there any general advice that you could give to them in terms of basic guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of basic guidelines of health, we know who are far more susceptible to get ill if they get the virus. And on the government website, there's a long list of those people. And a lot of those people would have already received guidance from their clinicians, from their consultant about that. We also know that other conditions, such as, for instance, asthma, well-controlled asthma, if people aren't on oral steroids, they are a relatively low risk of getting serious complications from coronavirus. The basic advice comes down to simple things like washing your hands, having those hygiene methods at home, keeping socially distant, but also making sure that you look after your mental health as well as your physical health in terms of going out, in terms of keeping in contact with people, in terms of regular exercise and decent eating. There were certain concerns right at the start of this that people might ignore some of that advice, drink more, stay indoors. What I've seen, particularly in Ramsey, is some people for the first time actually valuing going out for a walk, valuing physical exercise. And I'd really like to bank that. The bike shops have sold out. Let's carry on, encouraging people to cycle, whether it's to the shops or to work. Let's get something good out of what's been a very dark period for the Isle of Man.
But personally, I'd like to apologise because my partner bought the final bike in Ramsey Bike Shop only on Saturday as well, incidentally. Connor, I can see you waiting patiently. I think you have a further question, and then we'll move back to Stuart if you have a final question as well. But Connor.
Yes, thank you again. You mentioned that students and parents should plan as if they are going to university in September. May I ask when we will know the rules on doing this, especially when considering that results day is on the 13th of August?
Yeah. What we've been trying to encourage in terms of the department is people applying for student grants, and so those are now open. Certain universities have in the past given out fairly mixed messages about whether they've been opening or not, but today quite a few of the universities said they would be opening, but things would be different. Things like Freshers' Week might be virtual, some of the pubs and clubs might be closed, people might be taught in smaller groups to try to reduce the risk. Because again, university environments can be high risk for spreads of infection. And we've seen that in the past in terms of things like meningitis and mumps and measles. So I think the universities are taking that on board. And hopefully, if you apply for university and are accepted, you'll get a lot more guidance as we go through July and August in terms of the actual structure of the course as it starts. And hopefully by after Christmas, we can then normalise a lot of that. In terms of the travel arrangements, again, the Council of Ministers are reviewing this on a weekly or bi-weekly basis to make sure that we're following the best advice for the Isle of Man in terms of the clinical situation here, the clinical situation in the United Kingdom, and the advice of the clinical team to actually make sure it's safe for people to go backwards and forwards, safe for them, but also safe for our community, in that if they do come back and there is that risk, that they'll be asked to self-isolate and quarantine.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Connor. And Stuart, if you have your final question as well. No, we're going to give Stuart a miss then in that case. I'm not sure he's looking at us, but I think he might be in the car. I can see Eric raising his hand. So, Eric, the final question from the floor, over to you.
Yeah, there's two questions. Have you any idea when the swimming pools will open? And also now that we have a new minister at the DOI, do you think there's any chance of him actually looking and doing something about mobility buggies being banned on buses, because the minister has just left, refused to even speak to me, never answered an email or a phone call?
Well, Eric, I apologise for that. What we're doing in terms of government is indeed looking at mobility scooters going onto buses as part of the Equality Act, and this was brought up in the House of Keys recently. So I'm sure that the new minister will actually look at that and try to make sure that public transport is accessible for all. Absolutely. In terms of swimming pools, it's very interesting that there's good evidence that chlorine itself, so the normal chlorine you get in swimming pools, actually kills off coronavirus. So swimming would be a very useful sport to have, a very safe sport. The issues are more to do with the changing facilities and actually how we deal with regular cleaning there to make sure that people who go in and have to change before they swim and change afterwards are in a safe environment. So we're working on that in terms of indoor sporting facilities, and we'll certainly open the swimming pools as soon as it's safe to do so. Again, it may be different to begin with lane swimming, so we can socially distance to a degree rather than a free-for-all fun session, but we will be trying to get the swimming pools back into operation, because we know that physical exercise really helps people both physically and mentally.
I actually have at the minute a live case in front of the Equality Tribunal waiting for a response from the DOI. If the new minister could pull his finger out, it might save the expense of having to have a tribunal.
Absolutely. I'll take that up with him.
It's nice to see that you've been kept busy during the last 9 or 10 weeks, Eric, as well. Thank you very much for your questions, and also to Connor and Maria as well, and indeed Stuart. Thank you very much, all of you, for your questions. We started on education, so let's finish on education. I know just before this there was a teaching union pay dispute. You walked in on the sort of the 11th hour of that, and it's carried on the 12th, 13th, etc. But have you made a new offer to the union since becoming minister? And if so, what was the outcome of that?
There was a new offer just before the state of emergency was declared. Unfortunately, that was found unacceptable by the unions, and so things have been put on hold. What we've said, though, is that this is an ongoing dispute. It needs to be settled. We need to be able to draw a line and move on positively for the good of teachers, but particularly for the good of the education services on the Isle of Man. They are excellent, but there's always room for improvement, and we need to provide those services to pupils and their families. So once the state of emergency is lifted, we will be looking at reopening those talks, drawing a line, making a settlement, getting it secured so we can move forward together with the unions.
And just finally, if you like, was a percentage increase offered, and did it please some of the unions, if not all of them? Because I appreciate you're dealing with 3 or 4 here.
There are 4 teacher unions on the Isle of Man. Throughout this period, we've been working with them extremely well. They've been coming up with very good ideas in terms of how we move forward through a very difficult period for everyone. And what I want to do is, again, try to use that cooperation, use that increased communication with unions to reach a settlement, to draw a line under the previous dispute, which has been going on for 18 months. It's not been nice. Nobody's liked it. Let's get it sorted so we can move on. Because the education service on the Isle of Man is far too precious to be put on hold by this sort of thing. We need to have a decent settlement where the teachers themselves know about career progression, where we can attract, recruit and retain staff, because I'm very keen on expanding the excellent provision we have at the moment, and for that we need the best teachers.
We could talk about this a lot longer, but I think we are out of time.
Yep.
Dr. Allenson, thank you for your time. Really appreciate that this afternoon.
Well, James, I'd just like to thank you. I'd like to thank those who've joined us online, but also thank all the people who sent in questions. One of the keys about education is communication, but one of the keys about the Isle of Man government, particularly during this difficult time, has been trying to get the message across, to listen to people's voices, react to that, and then get that message back. And I'd like to thank you and also the rest of the media team for doing that.
Well, hopefully there'll be a further opportunity. I have been given an email address, actually, to give you to submit further questions. And again, apologies, we couldn't reach them all today, but we've tried to ask as many as possible. The address is COVID-19 community support at gov.im. COVID-19 community support at gov.im, and that's just a reminder for a future Q&A briefing we'll hope to have. Please email us any questions over in the near future. I'm just delighted we've got a second podium. It makes it so much easier. We will try and get as many questions asked as possible, and hopefully we'll speak to you very soon. Thanks very much for your company, everybody, and a very good afternoon.